There's a moment when the noise stops, not the external noise that keeps grinding, that machinery of desperate voices clawing for validation, for attention, for the scraps of recognition that most mistake for power. No, I'm talking about the internal noise, the voice that once whispered your doubts, your fears, your need to belong, the voice that made you human in all the most limiting ways. When that voice dies, something else awakens. You see, most people spend their entire lives trapped inside a cage they can't even see. They call it reality, but it's really just a collective hallucination, a shared agreement to remain blind to the actual mechanics of how the world operates. They participate in rituals they don't understand, follow rules they didn't create, and wonder why they feel powerless, despite living in democracies that promise them agency. But there are others, a rare breed who discover something most never will, that the cage has no lock. It never did. This discovery doesn't come through enlightenment or meditation or any of the spiritual bypasses that promise transcendence without sacrifice. It comes through something far more brutal, a deliberate death. Not of the body, but of the illusions that keep most people tethered to a reality designed to extract their energy while giving them just enough comfort to prevent rebellion. The process begins with withdrawal, not the kind of withdrawal that signals depression or defeat, but the strategic retreat of a general who realizes the battle being fought is not the war worth winning. You start to notice patterns others miss because they're too embedded in the system to see its architecture. You observe from outside the game long enough to understand that what most people call life is actually just an elaborate performance, a theater where everyone has forgotten their acting. During this period of deliberate isolation, something profound occurs. The social conditioning that once felt natural begins to reveal itself as artificial. The emotional reactions that once felt automatic start to seem optional. The beliefs about fairness, about how things should work, about the inherent goodness of institutions and people, these comforting fictions begin to dissolve. And in that dissolution, you glimpse something most never see, the actual structure of power. Power isn't what they teach you in civics class. It's not voting or petitions or the illusion of representation. Real power operates in the shadows of human psychology, in the spaces between what people say and what they do, in the gap between their conscious intentions and their unconscious programming. Real power understands that humans are predictable in ways they themselves don't recognize, that their emotional responses can be engineered, their decisions influenced, their entire reality curated. But here's where it transcends mere manipulation. The person who emerges from this process of deliberate death and rebirth doesn't just understand these mechanisms, they embody them. They don't just see the game, they become the game. They realize that in a world where most people are unconsciously playing roles, the person who is consciously directing the play holds absolute advantage. Let me show you exactly how this manifests. Picture yourself in a meeting room. Standard corporate theater, fluorescent lights casting their sickly glow over a conference table where 8 people sit pretending their opinions matter. The meeting has devolved into what it always devolves into, a performance of competence designed to cover the fact that no one really knows what they're doing. Sarah from marketing is explaining why the Q3 numbers are concerning. Tom from sales is getting defensive. Jennifer from operations is trying to play peacekeeper. Standard human drama, playing out according to scripts written by evolution and reinforced by culture. Then someone turns to you. What do you think about Sarah's concerns? Before your transformation, you might have felt pressure to contribute something meaningful, to prove your worth, to navigate the social dynamics carefully. You might have analyzed the data, considered the politics, tried to find the diplomatic middle ground. But now you see what's really happening. Sarah isn't concerned about Q3 numbers. She's terrified that her recent restructuring recommendations, which everyone knows were poorly thought out, are about to be exposed as ineffective. Her concern is a preemptive strike designed to deflect blame. Tom isn't defensive because he believes in his numbers. He's defensive because his commission structure depends on maintaining certain illusions about pipeline health. Jennifer isn't peacekeeping. She's positioning herself as the rational adult in the room, a classic play for soft power. So you don't engage with their stated positions. You engage with their actual motivations. You look directly at Sarah for exactly 3 seconds. Not aggressive, not dismissive, just long enough to let her know you see through the performance. Then you speak, your voice carrying the kind of calm that only comes from someone who has nothing to prove. The numbers are telling us exactly what we need to know. The question isn't whether we like what they're saying. You pause, let the silence do its work. Watch as Tom starts to shift in his seat, as Jennifer's peacekeeping expression falters, as Sarah realizes her deflection strategy just got neutralized. Sarah, your restructuring has been in place for 4 months. These are your results. Tom, your pipeline projections assumed market conditions that everyone in this room knew were optimistic. Jennifer, your operations have been covering for systematic inefficiencies instead of addressing them. Another pause. You're not angry. You're not accusatory. You're simply stating facts with the detachment of someone describing the weather. We can keep pretending these are mysterious external forces, or we can acknowledge that we're seeing the predictable consequences of known decisions. What we can't do is waste time performing surprise about outcomes we engineered. The room goes quiet. Not the uncomfortable quiet of people who are offended, but the deeper quiet of people who suddenly realize they're in the presence of someone operating from an entirely different framework. This is what happens when you stop participating in the collective fantasy that human behavior is mysterious, that organizational problems are complex puzzles requiring elaborate solutions. Most problems in human systems aren't actually problems. They're features. They exist because they serve someone's interests, even if those interests are unconscious. Sarah's restructuring wasn't designed to improve efficiency. It was designed to give her something to point to as leadership initiative on her performance review. Tom's optimistic projections weren't based on market analysis. They were based on his psychological need to be the bearer of good news. Jennifer's operational band-aids weren't addressing root causes, because addressing root causes would require admitting that the systems she's responsible for are fundamentally flawed. But here's what happens next, and this is where it gets dangerous. 3 weeks later, Sarah schedules a one-on-one meeting with you. She comes in with what she thinks is strategic vulnerability, sharing that she's been feeling unsupported in her role, that she's concerned about team dynamics, that she values your perspective and wants to collaborate more effectively. The old you might have fallen for this, might have felt flattered by her apparent respect for your insight, might have offered reassurance or partnership or whatever she was fishing for. But you see what's actually happening. Sarah has identified you as a threat to the comfortable illusions that protect her position. She's trying to neutralize that threat by pulling you into an alliance, by making you complicit in her narrative, by transforming you from external observer to internal participant. So you do something that stops her cold. You smile. Not a warm smile, not a friendly smile, the kind of smile that says you find the entire performance amusing. Sarah, you say, leaning back in your chair, you're trying to manage me. She starts to protest, but you continue with the same calm detachment. You're not here because you value collaboration. You're here because I called out the gap between your intentions and your results, and you need to control how I perceive that gap. You're trying to turn me into an ally so I'll stop being an observer. You pause, watching as her professional mask starts to slip. But here's what you don't understand. I'm not interested in being managed. I'm not interested in your version of team dynamics. I'm interested in what actually works. And what actually works doesn't require your comfort or your buy-in. This is the moment she realizes she's dealing with someone who operates from a completely different paradigm. Someone who doesn't need her approval, doesn't fear her disapproval, and isn't susceptible to the social pressures that keep most people in line. But the real revelation isn't in how you handle Sarah. It's in what happens to you during these interactions. You feel nothing. Not nothing in the sense of emptiness or depression, nothing in the sense of emotional neutrality. Sarah's anxiety doesn't trigger your anxiety. Her manipulation attempts don't anger you. Her attempts to make you complicit don't tempt you. You observe her strategies the way a chess master observes an amateur's opening moves, with professional interest, but no emotional investment. This is what Machiavelli understood when he wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. He wasn't advocating cruelty for its own sake. He was recognizing that emotional manipulation only works on people who need emotional validation. When you stop needing that validation, you become immune to one of humanity's most powerful control mechanisms. And once you're immune, you can use those mechanisms yourself. Here's exactly how this works in practice. You're at a social gathering. Standard tribal dynamics, people clustering into groups based on shared interests, professional status, perceived social hierarchy. Everyone's performing their personality, displaying their wit, their knowledge, their charm. The usual human marketplace, where attention is currency and everyone's either buying or selling. Someone you've never met approaches your group and within minutes starts dominating the conversation. Classic alpha display, loud voice, interrupting others, claiming expertise on topics he clearly knows little about. The group starts to fragment as people lose interest or get annoyed, but nobody directly challenges him because that would be confrontational. You watch this unfold with the detached interest of an anthropologist studying tribal behavior. You see exactly what he's doing, using volume and aggression to claim social territory, banking on the fact that most people will submit rather than engage in direct conflict. You also see exactly why it's working. The group's social conditioning prioritizes avoiding confrontation over protecting their own conversational space. Then he makes the mistake of trying to include you in his performance. Don't you think? He says, turning to you after making some pronouncement about cryptocurrency or politics or whatever expertise he's currently performing. The old you might have politely agreed or offered a diplomatic response or found some way to validate his contribution while subtly correcting it. But that version of you needed social acceptance, feared social rejection, operated within the framework of polite interaction. This version of you recognizes opportunity. You look at him for a moment, not long enough to seem aggressive, just long enough to let him know you're evaluating him. Then you speak, your voice carrying the kind of casual authority that doesn't need to announce itself. No, that's it. Just no. No explanation, no elaboration, no softening social niceties. You deliver it with the same tone you might use to decline a second helping of dessert. The effect is immediate and devastating. His performance momentum stops cold. The group's attention, which had been fragmenting, suddenly refocuses. He's forced to either escalate the confrontation or back down, and escalation would require acknowledging that his entire approach was a dominance display rather than genuine conversation. So he tries to recover. "Well, I just think that—" "I know what you think," you interrupt, still speaking with that same casual authority. "Everyone knows what you think. You've been explaining what you think for the last 10 minutes. But you asked what I think, and I think you're wrong." Another pause. "You're not angry, not hostile, just matter of fact. If you actually want to discuss it, we can discuss it. But if you just want to perform expertise, you can find a different audience." This is what happens when someone who has stopped needing social approval encounters someone whose entire strategy depends on others' need for social approval. The social dynamics don't just shift, they completely invert. But here's where it gets interesting. You don't humiliate him, you don't destroy him. You give him exactly what someone operating from genuine confidence would give, an opportunity to choose a different approach. "Cryptocurrency is interesting," you continue, as if the previous exchange hadn't happened. "What got you interested in it? Now you're in control of the interaction. You've established that performance-based dominance won't work with you, but you've also demonstrated that genuine conversation is possible. You've given him a choice: continue the alpha display and get systematically dismantled, or drop the performance and engage authentically. Most people, when given this choice clearly and without malice, will choose authenticity. And when they do, something remarkable happens. The entire group's energy shifts. The relief is palpable. Everyone was tired of the performance, but nobody knew how to stop it without being rude. You stopped it by being more direct than rudeness, more honest than politeness. This is the paradox of post-transformation social power. Mercy becomes more terrifying than punishment, directness more disarming than diplomacy, authenticity more powerful than performance. But social gatherings are easy mode. Let me show you how this works in higher stakes environments. You're in a relationship, romantic, professional, familial, doesn't matter. The specific context is less important than the underlying dynamic. Someone you're connected to starts employing emotional manipulation as a strategy for getting what they want. Maybe it's guilt, after everything I've done for you. Maybe it's manufactured crisis. I don't know how I'm going to handle this. Maybe it's threat of abandonment. Maybe we're just not compatible. Before your transformation, these tactics would have worked. You would have felt the guilt, responded to the crisis, feared the abandonment. You would have adjusted your behavior to manage their emotions, sacrificed your own needs to maintain the relationship's equilibrium. But now you see emotional manipulation for what it really is, a strategy deployed by people who believe they can't get what they want through direct request or fair exchange. It's not actually about the emotions, it's about power. It's about training you to prioritize their comfort over your own autonomy. So when they deploy their strategy, you don't respond to the emotions, you respond to the strategy. "You're trying to manipulate me," you say, with the same calm directness you'd use to point out that it's raining. They'll deny it, of course. "I'm not trying to manipulate you, I'm just telling you how I feel." "No," you respond, "you're telling me how you want me to feel about how you feel. You're using your emotions as a tool to change my behavior. That's manipulation." This stops them cold because most people don't expect their manipulation strategies to be named directly. They expect resistance, argument, defensiveness, anything but clear identification of what they're actually doing. "When you want something from me," you continue, "ask directly. When you're upset about something, tell me what you're upset about and what you need. But don't perform emotions to engineer outcomes. I won't respond to that." This is what happens when someone who has stopped being susceptible to emotional manipulation encounters someone whose entire relationship strategy depends on emotional manipulation. The relationship doesn't just change, it gets redefined at a fundamental level. But here's what makes this approach devastating. You're not rejecting their emotions or invalidating their feelings. You're simply refusing to let their emotions dictate your choices. You're drawing a clear boundary between their internal experience and your external behavior. Most people can't argue with this because when stated directly, it's obviously reasonable. Nobody has the right to engineer your emotions or determine your choices, regardless of how strongly they feel about the outcome they want. And yet, this boundary destroys most people's entire approach to relationships. They've never learned to ask directly for what they want because they've never had to. They've always been able to use emotional pressure to influence outcomes. When that stops working, they're forced to develop entirely new skills: honesty, direct communication, genuine negotiation. Some people rise to this challenge and become better partners, friends, family members. Others reveal that their entire relationship strategy was based on manipulation, and they simply can't function without it. Either way, you win. Either you get better relationships, or you identify and exit manipulative ones. Either outcome improves your life dramatically. But this is still individual level dynamics. Let me show you how this scales to institutional power. You're dealing with any bureaucratic system, corporate, governmental, educational, medical, doesn't matter. These systems are designed around a specific assumption that individuals will submit to process regardless of whether that process serves their interests. They assume you'll accept inefficiency, incompetence, and indifference as long as they're presented within an official framework. Most people do accept this. They complain, they get frustrated, they feel powerless, but they ultimately submit because they believe they have no choice. They've been conditioned to believe that institutions have authority that transcends their actual competence or effectiveness. But you've stopped accepting institutional authority as legitimate simply because it's institutional. You evaluate systems based on results, not process. You judge people based on competence, not credentials. You assess policies based on outcomes, not intentions. This shift in perspective doesn't make you anarchist or rebellious. It makes you pragmatic in ways that institutional thinking can't handle. You're on hold with customer service. The representative finally picks up and immediately starts reading a script about how much they value your business and how they're committed to excellence. Then they ask how they can help you. You explain your issue clearly and specifically. They respond with another script about understanding your frustration and wanting to help, then ask you to repeat information you just provided. When you point out that you just gave them that information, they explain that they need to verify details for security purposes. The old you might have gotten angry, might have played along with their inefficient process, might have accepted that this is just how these systems work. But you see what's actually happening. You're dealing with someone whose job is to follow scripts, not solve problems. The entire interaction is designed to make you accept process as a substitute for results. So you interrupt the performance. Stop reading scripts to me. I don't need to be valued or understood. I need this problem solved. Can you solve it, or do you need to transfer me to someone who can? The representative thrown off script might try to explain company policy or process requirements. You interrupt again. I'm not asking about your policy. I'm asking about your capability. Can you solve this problem or not? This approach bypasses the entire theatrical framework these interactions are designed around. You're not playing the role of frustrated customer seeking validation. You're not accepting the role of supplicant navigating bureaucratic mazes. You're simply demanding functionality from a system that claims to provide it. Most institutional representatives have never encountered this approach because most people accept the theater as necessary. When you refuse to participate in the performance, you force them to either deliver actual results or explicitly admit they can't. And here's what's remarkable. This approach works, not always, not immediately, but far more often than the standard approach of polite submission to process. Because underneath all the scripts and policies and procedures, these systems still need to function. When you demand functionality directly, you often get it. But the real revelation isn't that institutions respond to directness. It's that they depend on your willingness to accept indirection. Their entire power structure relies on people believing that process is more important than results, that politeness is more valuable than efficiency, that institutional authority deserves respect, regardless of institutional competence. When you stop believing this, institutional power over you effectively ends. This pattern scales infinitely. Political systems that depend on people accepting symbolic representation instead of demanding actual results. Economic systems that depend on people accepting their assigned role instead of optimizing for their own interests. Social systems that depend on people prioritizing collective comfort over individual autonomy. All of these systems lose their power over someone who simply refuses to participate in the collective fantasy that makes them possible. But here's where it transcends mere non-compliance and becomes actual power. When you consistently operate from this framework, when you reliably respond to reality instead of theater, when you consistently demand functionality instead of accepting process, when you persistently evaluate based on results instead of intentions, something profound happens to how others relate to you. They start to treat you differently, not just with more respect, though that happens, not just with more caution, though that happens too. They start to treat you as someone who operates from an entirely different paradigm, someone who can't be managed through normal channels, someone who has to be dealt with directly. This is when you realize you've crossed a threshold that most people never even know exists. You've moved from being subject to systems of power to being someone who understands and navigates those systems consciously. You've stopped being a player in games others designed and started designing your own games. And this is where Machiavelli's deepest insight becomes relevant. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are. The person who has undergone this transformation appears, from the outside, to be simply more confident, more direct, more decisive. What others don't see is the fundamental shift in perception that makes these qualities possible. They don't see that you've stopped needing their approval and therefore can't be controlled through approval or disapproval. They don't see that you've stopped fearing social rejection and therefore can't be managed through inclusion or exclusion. They don't see that you've stopped accepting institutional authority as legitimate and therefore can't be governed through process or procedure. What they see is someone who gets results where others get frustrated. Someone who cuts through complexity where others get lost in it. Someone who makes things happen where others make excuses. And they want to know how. This is when you realize that the process you've been through, the deliberate death of illusions, the strategic withdrawal from collective fantasy, the systematic reconstruction of your relationship to power, isn't just personal transformation. It's the creation of a resource that others desperately need but don't know how to access. You become someone people come to when normal approaches don't work, when diplomatic solutions have failed, when institutional channels have proven inadequate, when the stakes are high enough that results matter more than process. You become the person others call when they need someone who can see clearly, Think strategically and act decisively without being constrained by the social and institutional frameworks that limit most people's options. This is real power. Not the performance of power, not the symbols of power, but the actual capacity to influence outcomes in accordance with your will. The capacity to see options others can't see, to take actions others won't take, to achieve results others can't achieve. And here's the beautiful irony. This power grows in direct proportion to how little you need it for your own validation. The less you need to feel powerful, the more powerful you actually become. The less you need to appear dominant, the more dominance becomes available to you. The less you need control, the more control naturally flows toward you. This happens because power at its deepest level isn't about dominating others. It's about not being dominated by anything. Not by your own emotions, not by others' expectations, not by institutional pressures, not by social conventions. It's about maintaining sovereign agency regardless of external circumstances. Most people spend their lives being dominated by forces they don't even recognize as forces. They make decisions based on what others will think. They choose actions based on what's socially acceptable. They limit their options based on what's institutionally approved. They compromise their values based on what's politically expedient. They call this being reasonable, being mature, being responsible, but it's actually a form of voluntary servitude, a systematic surrender of agency to systems that don't serve their interests. When you stop participating in this surrender, when you reclaim full agency over your choices and actions, you don't just become more powerful, you become a different kind of person entirely. Someone who operates from sovereignty rather than submission, from clarity rather than confusion, from purpose rather than programming. And in a world full of people operating from submission, confusion, and programming, someone operating from sovereignty, clarity, and purpose doesn't just have advantages, they have what amounts to superpowers. This is what emerges from the deliberate death and rebirth process described at the beginning. Not a new personality, not a new philosophy, not a new identity, but a new relationship to existence itself. A way of being that transcends the limitations most people accept as natural and inevitable. The person who completes this transformation doesn't just understand power, they embody it. They don't just see the game, they are the game. They don't just navigate systems, they create systems. And once you've crossed this threshold, there's no going back. Not because you can't, but because you won't want to. Once you've experienced true sovereignty, everything else feels like prison. Once you've tasted real power, everything else tastes like pretense. This is your invitation to that transformation. Not to become someone different, but to become who you actually are underneath all the conditioning, all the compromise, all the voluntary limitation that our systems of control depend upon. The cage has no lock. It never did. The only question is whether you have the courage to stop pretending otherwise. Power doesn't explain itself. Power doesn't justify itself. Power doesn't apologize for itself. Power simply is. And now, so are you.